The moment she walked through the door, the room made a decision about her. Not out loud, not with words, with the particular silence that forms in a place built on hierarchy when something arrives that does not fit the shape of what that hierarchy expects. She was 23 years old. She was carrying a tote bag with a small Philippine flag pin on the strap. She had taken 3 connecting flights from Manila to London. She had not slept in 31 hours, and she was about to walk into the preliminary round of the Meridian Vocal Grand Prix, a competition that had, in its 42-year history, produced 11 Grammy winners, 4 who performed at the Royal Albert Hall before the age of 30, and not a single finalist from Southeast Asia. Not one. In 42 years. Her name was Isabel Reyes, and she had saved for 3 years to be in that room. The registration desk was staffed by a young British woman with a clipboard who looked at Isabel's entry form, then looked at her, then back at the form. She asked if Isabel had performed internationally before. Isabel said she had performed at the Ali Theater in Manila, at the Cultural Center of the Philippines, and at the Philippine International Convention Center in front of 12,000 people. The woman with the clipboard wrote something down. She did not ask a follow-up question. Isabel understood what that silence meant. She had spent her entire life understanding exactly what that silence meant. She found her assigned warm-up room at the end of a long corridor lined with photographs of previous winners, all of them framed in dark wood, all of them in formal recital attire, all of them European. She stood in front of those photographs for a moment. Then she walked past them. The warm-up room was small and had a piano that needed tuning. She did not need the piano. She closed the door. She stood in the center of the room. She breathed. And then she began to warm up her voice in the way her teacher, Lola Coring, had taught her in Batangas, starting from the lowest register she owned and climbing slowly, rung by rung, through every floor of the instrument that 23 years of living and a childhood spent singing in a concrete church with no air conditioning and no acoustic treatment had built inside her chest. It was during this warm-up that the corridor outside the room went quiet. Not immediately. First, there was the ambient noise of a competition building filling with competitors. Doors opening and closing, scales being run in adjacent rooms, the particular competitive hum of 240 singers from 31 countries, all preparing to be heard. And then, gradually, that noise thinned. A baritone from Edinburgh paused in the hallway. A mezzo-soprano from Copenhagen pressed her ear very slightly toward the wall without being aware she was doing it. A vocal coach from the Royal College of Music who was passing the corridor with a folder of sheet music stopped walking. He did not turn around. He just stopped, stood still, and listened. Isabel did not know any of this was happening. She was inside the room with her eyes closed and her hands loose at her sides, and her voice moving through a warm-up exercise that her Lola Coring had learned from her own teacher in the Visayas decades before Isabel was born, a chain of vocal knowledge that ran backward through generations of Filipino women who had never stood in a London competition corridor and never needed to. What the vocal coach heard through that door was not simply a voice. He had heard voices every day for 29 years at the Royal College. What he heard was something that voice training cannot fully explain and competition rubrics cannot fully contain. He heard the specific fullness that forms when a voice has been shaped not by a conservatoire, but by grief and joy and corrugated iron rooftops and fiestas and the specific acoustics of a small Philippine church where every note you sing comes back to you from 3 directions and teaches you over years how to fill a space not by force but by resonance. He heard depth where the room had been expecting brightness. He heard control that did not announce itself. He stood in that corridor for 4 minutes. Then he wrote something in the margin of his folder. Then he kept walking. The preliminary round of the Meridian Vocal Grand Prix is judged by a panel of 5, each of them with credentials that occupy entire paragraphs in the competition's printed program. The panel that year included a former principal soprano of the English National Opera, a recording producer who had worked with 3 of the most celebrated classical crossover artists of the previous decade, a conductor who had led orchestras in Vienna and Prague, a vocal professor from the Guildhall School of Music, and a woman named Margaret Ashby, who who had been the competition's senior adjudicator for 19 years and who had heard so many voices in that time that she had developed the capacity to assess a singer's technical foundation within the first 4 bars of any piece. Margaret Ashby had never given a perfect score in the preliminary round, not once in 19 years. She believed it was not something the preliminary round was designed to produce. Isabel walked onto the preliminary stage in the second slot of the afternoon session. She was wearing a white dress that her mother had sewn for her in Batangas. The embroidery at the collar was Filipino. She stood at the microphone. She did not introduce herself with the usual statement of intent that most competitors delivered, the practiced declaration of artistic purpose that the competition had come to expect from the more seasoned participants. She simply said her name and the piece she had chosen, and then she sang. She had chosen a Filipino art song, not an operatic standard, not a Schubert Lied or a Puccini aria or any of the works that most competitors used to signal their classical credentials to a panel that knew those works in its bones. She had chosen a piece by Francisco Santiago, the Filipino composer who lived from 1889 to 1947 and who built an entire language of classical music rooted in the melodic landscape of the Philippines, a landscape of heat and water and longing and the particular kind of love that Filipinos carry in their chests like a second heartbeat. The panel looked at each other when she announced the piece. One of them glanced down at the program, another made a very small notation. Margaret Ashby said nothing, and then Isabel began. The first phrase of the Santiago piece unfolds slowly. It does not rush toward its own beauty. It earns it the way all things earned through patience earn it, by making you wait long enough that when it arrives, you understand it has been there the whole time, and you were simply not yet ready to receive it. By the second phrase, the recording producer had stopped writing. By the third, the ENO soprano had placed her pen flat on the table. The conductor from Vienna was very still. The Guildhall professor had both hands pressed together in front of his lips. And Margaret Ashby, who had sat behind that table for 19 years and heard every voice the world had considered worth sending to London, was doing something that none of the other adjudicators had ever seen her do in a preliminary round. She was leaning forward, not slightly, fully. Her elbows were on the table. Her chin was resting on her folded hands. Her eyes were not moving from Isabel's face. The piece has a middle section that modulates into a key that most singers, trained on European harmonic conventions, approach with the caution of unfamiliar territory. Isabel did not approach it with caution. She walked into it the way you walk into a room you have lived in your whole life, because she had. Because Francisco Santiago's harmonic language was not unfamiliar territory to her. It was home. It was the sound of the country that had made her, translated into notation by a man who had understood that the Philippines contained a beauty so specific and so complete that it required its own musical language to hold it. She sang that middle section with a freedom that the panel had not heard in the preliminary round of the Meridian Vocal Grand Prix in any of the 42 years the competition had existed. Because no one had ever brought that language into this room before. No one had ever trusted that this room was large enough to hold it. When the piece ended, the silence in that room lasted 6 seconds. 6 seconds is a very long time in a judged vocal competition. Applause from the panel is not customary in the preliminary round. The panel applauded, all 5 of them. Margaret Ashby was the first. She scored Isabel Reyes a perfect score, her first in 19 years. She did not explain the score to her colleagues in the moment. She did not need to. They had all heard the same thing she had heard. Isabel walked off the stage and back through the corridor past the framed photographs of 42 years of European winners. She did not look at them this time either, not because she was dismissing them, because she was thinking about Lola Coring. She was thinking about a woman in Batangas who had taught her to find the bottom of her voice before she reached for the top. She was thinking about a concrete church with no air conditioning, where her instrument had been built, note by note, across years of singing not for audiences, but for the practice of it. She was thinking about the women who came before Lola Coring, who had carried the same knowledge and passed it forward through generations without conservatoire accreditation or competition certificates or framed photographs in any corridor. She was thinking about Francisco Santiago, who had built a musical language for a people the world had consistently underestimated and who had trusted that one day that language would find its way into rooms it had never been invited into and fill those rooms completely. She was thinking about her mother in Batangas who had sewn the embroidery on her collar. She did not win the finals of the Meridian Vocal Grand Prix. She was eliminated in the semi-final round after a judging controversy that the competition's observers debated for months, one adjudicator later acknowledging publicly that the scoring criteria had not been designed with a musical language like Santiago's in mind, and that the rubric had been inadequate to the task of measuring what it had encountered. She flew home to Manila. She walked through the arrivals gate at the airport and her mother was waiting for her. She did not win. But Margaret Ashby, 19 years behind that table, published a piece in the competition's annual journal the following autumn. She wrote that in 4 decades of adjudication, she had heard voices that stunned, and voices that moved, and voices that demonstrated a technical mastery that she would carry with her for the rest of her career. She wrote that in 4 decades, she had heard only one voice that made her understand while it was still singing that the room it was singing in was being asked to become larger than it had previously agreed to be. She did not name Isabel directly. She described only a preliminary round contestant from the Philippines who had chosen a piece by Francisco Santiago. The piece, she wrote, had required nothing from the room except the willingness to listen. And when the room finally listened, it discovered that it had been waiting for precisely that sound for longer than it knew. Margaret Ashby ended the piece with a single sentence. She wrote that excellence does not wait for an invitation. It simply requires, eventually, an open door. The door, she wrote, had been open for 42 years. It had simply taken that long for the right person to walk through it.